21 would take the ultimate step in quiz show rigging. Most contestants were cast as though they were actors, every detail carefully orchestrated. Contestants were now full partners in the deception.
From Forest Hills, New York, Mr. Herbert Stemple.
Herb Stemple was a young man whom I had coached in his appearances on 21. When he applied to the show and he took the test, he scored a very, very high score. He was the type of contestant who could very well antagonize viewers.
One afternoon, I received a letter, and it said, we'd like you to take our tests. It was a 3.5-hour test, very, very difficult, because it had about 100 different categories. And I was told that I would be contacted. Dan Enright, the producer, called me on the phone. He said he'd like to see me right away. And he came up to the apartment, and then all of a sudden, he leaned back in the sofa and said, how would you like to make $25,000? I said to him, who wouldn't want to make $25,000? And he said to me something in essence which was like, play ball and we'll make sure you make $25,000. I said, fine, what do I have to do? He says, first of all, he says, you're going to be on the program tomorrow night.
How do you, because you have to take care of them, how do you manage to support yourself and your family? Well, I get $160 a month from the GI Bill of Rights from the Veterans Administration.
The whole idea was to make me appear like an ex-GI working his way through college. The reason I had been asked to put on this old, ill-fitting suit and get this Marine-type haircut was to make me appear as what you would call today a nerd, a square.
Well, it's a very personal question to ask, and it sounds very, very rough what you do. Yes, things are not so good, but...
I was never to call the Master of Ceremonies, Jack Barry, Jack. I was always to call him Mr. Barry and be very, very humble and very sheepish. On the first program I was on for approximately 4 minutes, and I won approximately $9,000. I had never had that much money in my life, and I was absolutely flabbergasted.
If either of you want to stop the game, you must tell me so right now.
I'll stop.
Then you win.
And I went home and said to my wife, gee, this is the easiest money I ever made in my life.
Sorry, Mr. Pelladay. You just won $9,000.
I used to go down to Enright's office every Wednesday afternoon before the show. Dan Enright would pull out cards with the questions and answers that would be used that evening. I ran through them. He would instruct me when to pause, when to mop my brow. Everything was very carefully choreographed.
How many do you want to try for? I'll try 11.
The hardest part of the show was not remembering the answers or knowing the answers, but rather remembering mop your brow twice, count to 10, and breathe heavily. This was the hardest part of the show, was remembering the stage directions which Enright had choreographed.
You have scored 21 points. You have scored 21 points.
We often turned off the air conditioning in the isolation booths so that they would start to perspire. And we did coach them in terms of what dramatic pauses to take, when to ask for a question to be repeated, when to miss a question, and sometimes they would deliberately miss a question in order to heighten the drama of the moment.
Mr. Stemple, can you come back here next week, meet your next opponent, and tell us whether you want to...
As weeks went by, people began to recognize me more and more. I got more and more fan mail. My classmates at college were very proud of me. My professors were proud of me. I just couldn't hold this inside of me, though, because I was overjoyed about being a celebrity, winning and so forth. I was overwhelmed.
I'm Jack Barry. For 6 weeks here on 21, a 29-year-old GI college student, Herbert Stemple, has successfully beaten all of his opponents and has run his winnings up to $69,500.
Then Dan Enright said to me, you know, Herb, you're not going to get all the money that you've won so far or are going to win. I said, what? What do you mean? He says, no, he says, we have to look out for ourselves. So I have a paper here which you're going to have to sign. I realized that if I didn't sign, I might not find myself on the program too much longer, so I decided to sign.
Even though Stemple had agreed to accept less money, it didn't matter. His ratings had begun to fall, and he had to go. A new contestant was moved into the challenger's booth to knock him off. A college instructor with a flair for acting who would become by far the most acclaimed of all quiz show contestants. His father was a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. His mother was a celebrated novelist. His uncle, a respected American historian. Van Doren's erudition provided parents with a welcomed antidote to Elvis Presley at a time when Americans feared education was in decline. Charles Van Doren presented a portrait of elegant New England charm. He and his family symbolized the ideals of integrity and intellectual achievement that seemed beyond reproach.
Winston Churchill wrote a series of 6...
His name became synonymous with the quiz shows, and his impact was immediate.
Lines stretched around the studio as the ratings skyrocketed. Tens of millions gathered in every part of the country to see if their new hero, Charles Van Doren, would beat Herb Stempel. Week after week, the drama and tension grew as Enright wrote the final act. No one seemed to question what they saw. In the 1950s, seeing was believing.
And then finally, at a particular moment, I told Herb Stempel that he was going to be losing that night to Charles Van Doren.
Catherine Howard.
Right, and what happened to her?
That's what happened to her. Considering Henry VIII, he probably divorced her or beheaded her. Let's see. Well, he divorced her. Did he behead Catherine Howard?
He did. You've got 18 points.
One of those questions on the final night involved the 1955 Academy Award winner.
Herb Stempel, you have 16 points. The category is movies and movie stars. What motion picture won the Academy Award for 1955?
I knew that the answer was Marty, but Dan Enright specifically wanted me to miss that question. This hurt me very deeply because this was one of my favorite pictures of all times, and I could never forget this. A few seconds before that, as I was trying to come up with the answer, I could have changed my mind. I could have said the answer is Marty instead of On the Waterfront. I would have won. There would have been no Charles Van Doren, no famous celebrity. Charles Van Doren would have gone back to teaching college, and my whole life would have been changed.
If either of you want to stop the game, you must tell me so right now.
I'll stop.
Then you win $20,000. Congratulations.
The night Charles Van Doren beat Herb Stempel, about 15 million viewers applauded Van Doren's triumph. As the nation's new hero, Charlie made the cover of Time, a distinction never bestowed on his illustrious father or uncle. Admiring students at Columbia University, where he taught English, put up signs directing visitors to the smartest man in the world. He received thousands of letters a week, including hundreds of marriage proposals. He signed a $50,000 a year contract to become a host on the Today Show and gave personal interviews to some 500 reporters. As book, lecture, and movie offers were waved in Van Doren's face, a resentful Herb Stempel would never forget how he had faded into the shadow of Van Doren's celebrity.
The investigation started by the district attorney in 1958, I believe it was. 1958 it was started when Herb Stempel advised the newspapers that he had been rigged.
The newspapers were filled with charges. The question that dominated the headlines for months was whether these charges could actually be proven by the district attorney. The producer of 21, Dan Enright, moved quickly to deny that any wrongdoing or fraud had taken place. Enright went on a counterattack, suing the Journal American and mounting a campaign to discredit Herb Stempel. At a sensational press conference, Dan Enright played a secretly made tape recording of a conversation he had with Herb Stempel. This tape was presented to the press to demonstrate that Stempel was mentally unstable. To further discredit Stempel, Enright also produced a letter that Stempel had signed at an earlier date, saying that 21 was an honest program, that Barry and Enright were beyond reproach, and that no rigging had taken place.
I was a damn fool to have signed such a thing, to have agreed to such a thing, when he again held out the prospects of jobs and money and this and that to me, and I succumbed to that.
In Lower Manhattan, the grand jury was convened for 9 months and heard over 150 witnesses. A majority of them, about 100 contestants, lied under oath. As a lone voice, Herb Stempel continued telling the truth to anyone who would listen. But it was Stempel's word against everyone else. There was still no corroborating evidence. Suddenly, to everyone's surprise, the grand jury testimony was sealed from the public by Judge Mitchell Schweitzer. An unprecedented move in New York State, by a judge whose intentions are still not clear. At the time, it was feared that the public might never learn what the grand jury had uncovered. Suspicious of a cover-up, Congress called an immediate investigation. Once just a trivial form of entertainment, quiz shows were now the subject of investigation at the highest level of government. It was a relatively obscure 21 contestant by the name of James Snodgrass who would finally provide indisputable supporting proof that 21 had been rigged. Snodgrass had documented every detail of the rigging in a series of registered letters he mailed to himself.
I didn't think it was terribly wrong, but something told me that I had better cover my ass on this. Before each show, I sent myself a registered letter with the questions, the answers, and my instructions as to how to comport myself in the isolation booth. Eventually, these letters ended up before a House investigating committee. Now there was proof that the show was fixed.
1 month after the hearings began, Charles Van Doren emerged from hiding to appear before a congressional committee. Up until that moment, Van Doren had been unable to admit the truth to anyone, not to his lawyer, not even to his family.
I said to the committee this morning that I was kind of like a child who refuses to admit a fact in the hope that it'll go away. I got panic-stricken. I've been afraid for a long time. I've been living in a kind of dread for 3 years. They've not been a happy 3 years. But I became almost panic-stricken then. And I didn't act very well in the next week. And so I just ran away. And my wife and I went up into New England, and I drove aimlessly around from town to town, trying to reach some kind of peace with myself, trying to come to some conclusion. I was so deeply involved with my family and my friends. I loved them so much. I could not bear to betray the faith that people had in me. My father had been saying to me, tell the truth. He didn't know what it was. I don't think he really cared what it was. It was just something that he knew was the right thing to do. I made a very, very big mistake. And I learned about making mistakes. I learned what you have to do when you make a mistake. I've also learned a lot about life and about human nature, about a man's responsibility.
Eventually, an anguished Charles Van Doren, one producer, and 17 other contestants were formally charged, arrested, and convicted of lying under oath to the New York grand jury. All pleaded guilty. All received suspended sentences. None served time in jail. The district attorney estimated that at least 100 others who testified with Van Doren, 2/3 of all those who faced the grand jury, had perjured themselves. The television quiz show scandal had wide-ranging consequences. Quiz producers were unofficially blacklisted for years and forced out of television. Many contestants in disgrace hid from their past. Networks took control of programs away from the sponsors. And federal regulations were enacted against broadcast fraud. The scandal left us feeling betrayed. Television had entered tens of millions of homes and lives in an era filled with trust. And the violation of that trust changed our view of a new medium in an age we still like to think of as innocent.